Hey guys, this is Anthony Morganti from OnlinePhotographyTraining.com. Welcome to my video series, Mastering Lightroom Classic CC. In this video, we're going to finally begin to process an image. We're going to talk about the basic tab that is in the right-hand panel of the Develop module of Lightroom Classic CC. Now, to begin with, my screen's kind of busy, and it could be distracting when it's busy. So I'm going to close down some of these panels. For example, this bottom film strip, I already determined I'm going to process this image, so I don't need this film strip down here. To close it down, you'll notice at the very bottom there's this little triangle. Click on that, and we've closed down that film strip. If I want to bring it back, just click on that triangle again. Similarly, this left-hand panel, I don't think I'm going to be using any of the functions over here on the left-hand panel. And there's a little triangle there. I'll click on that, and we close that down. Even this top panel, we could close that down as well. And we could open them all back up by clicking on their respective triangles. Now, as far as your processing workflow, there's really no right or wrong way to do it, and there's no specific order you have to go in. You don't have to begin with the basic tab. You could start anywhere you like. You could open a tool up and use a tool first if you prefer. But if you're just beginning, I do recommend that you begin with the basic tab. That will get you your image looking pretty good right away, and then it would probably help you determine what else it needs after that. So start with the basic tab if you're beginning, and we're going to do that. We're going to start right at the top of the tab, and you can see where it says treatment, color, and black and white. If you want this image to be processed as black and white, just click on black and white. Simple as that. You can see we have a monochrome image. I'm going to process this in color. Now below that you'll see it says profile. Lightroom uses what they call profiles to interpret the color and contrast in an image. And there's a number of different profiles you could choose from. By default, usually when you import a color image, you'll have the Adobe Color profile automatically picked. If you change it to black and white or import a black and white, you would have the Adobe Monochrome profile picked. But I mentioned there's a number of different profiles you could choose from. To open up what they call the profile browser to look at all the different profiles, you could click this little drop down and go to Browse, or to the right of that you'll see these four, I call them bricks. If you click on those, you opened up the profile browser. And you'll see that there's a number of different categories of profiles. And I mentioned that Lightroom comes with a number of them. If we look right here where it says Adobe RAW, there's a little triangle there. And if I click on that little triangle, opens it up, and we could see that there's 7 different Adobe RAW profiles. And by default, it picked this one, Adobe Color. If I just hover over the other ones, you'll get a sample of it in the main screen. So you can see there's Adobe Neutral, Adobe Landscape, Adobe Portrait, Adobe Standard, Adobe Vivid. And you can see how the color and contrast is slightly different from one to another. Now, the idea of profiles, it's supposed to be your base. You pick the profile rather early in your processing workflow, then process from that point on. Unlike a preset, over here on the left panel we have presets. Presets are meant to get you in and out of Lightroom relatively quickly. You pick a preset and it adjusts everything, hopefully, and gives you a finished image, or an image that is very nearly finished. So choose a preset if you're in a hurry and you want to get in and out of Lightroom, or pick a profile at the beginning of your workflow to give you a base to work off of. Now I mentioned there's a number that come with Lightroom. I'm showing you there's the Adobe RAW. I'm going to skip the next 2 for a second. And then we have Artistic. These all come with Lightroom. Black and white, 17 different black and white profiles. There's modern, they call modern, 10 different modern profiles. Vintage, 10 different vintage profiles. I think those are meant to give you kind of a film look. Now I skipped a couple here. Your camera has profiles as well, and they're going to be specific to your make and model camera. This image was shot with the Fujifilm X-T1, and my Fujifilm X-T1 has what they call film simulation profiles, and those are available in post in Lightroom. There's a Stia soft. Stia is a type of Fujifilm, Classic Chrome, Pro Negative, Standard and High, Pro Via, Velvia. So again, I could pick any of these profiles either in my camera when I took the shot or here in post in the profile browser. Below that is legacy profiles that are again specific to my model camera. So if you shoot Canon, you're going to see different stuff here. If you shoot Nikon, you're going to see different stuff here. Even if you shoot a different model Fujifilm camera, you may see different stuff here. So keep that in mind. Now below that are profiles that you obtain from a third party. I sell a number of profiles. You can see there's my Morganti alternate reality profiles, black and white profiles, and so on. So any profiles you either create yourself using Photoshop, obtained on the internet for free, or by purchase would get put here. So for this demonstration, I think I'm going to stick with the Adobe Color default profile that we're using. One thing I should add, though, before we leave the profile browser, is you could view all of them, just the color ones, just the black and white ones, and you could change how big the grid is. So when you pick grid, they're kind of small. If you pick large, you get a large preview. If you pick a list, you don't get a preview at all. You just have a list. Personally, I prefer grid. So we're going to close the profile browser by clicking on close, and that's it. I've determined I want to use this Adobe Color profile. Now the next part is white balance. White balance is very important, and those of you that shoot RAW will have a little more flexibility with your white balance than someone who shoots JPEG, and we'll explain as we go. There's 3 different ways you could adjust white balance in Lightroom. The first way is obvious. You could just come in here with these sliders and move them around. It's up to you. Just move them. You know, if the image was too cool, you'd move the temp slider to the right. If it was too warm, you'd move it to the left. You'd move the tint slider to compensate for any tinting the temp slider did to the highlights and shadows. Meaning, if you came in here and you moved your temp slider to the right, but you noticed the highlights got kind of a yellow tinge to them, your clouds became yellow, and you don't like that, you would use the tint slider to negate that a bit. So you'd move the tint slider to the right. You could see how the slider throw line here shows you kind of a color representation of what the slider will do. If you move it to the right, it gets these cooler tones, the tint slider to the right. If I move it to the left, the tint slider gets warmer tones. And it's backwards for the temp slider. If I move the temp slider to the right, I get the warmer tones, and to the left, the cooler tones. So you could come in here and just adjust these 2 sliders until it looks good to you. Now, if I want to reset any slider in Lightroom, doesn't matter, not just the temp or the temp and tint slider, any slider at all, just double click on the name of the slider and it will reset that slider to its default position. And there, so I reset those to their default position. Now another way you could adjust white balance is with this drop down here. You can see at the very top it's as shot. Most of us probably shoot with an automatic white balance setting in our camera. So that gets recorded to the RAW file and or JPEG. Hopefully you're shooting RAW again. And when you import the image into Lightroom, that's what is going to be as default, as shot. You could change that to auto. That's where Lightroom determines what the correct white balance should be and applies it to the image. And then if you're shooting RAW, you'll have the capability of doing all these others. Daylight, that won't be available again in a JPEG, only in a RAW file. Daylight, it's as though you had the white balance setting in your camera set to daylight. Cloudy, shade, tungsten, fluorescent, and flash. So again, that's why it generally is considered better to shoot RAW. One of the many reasons why it's generally considered better to shoot RAW is because your white balance capabilities are more versatile in post. You could come in here and really adjust it very easily with this drop down. Now if I'm just going to leave it as shot, I could just go with as shot. But there is a third way to adjust white balance in an image, and that's with this eyedropper. To use the eyedropper, simply click on it. And when you click on it, your cursor becomes the eyedropper. And you notice there's a square below the eyedropper there. And it says pick a target neutral. What that means is you're going to look for something that doesn't have color in it, something gray. That's neutral. And then simply click on that neutral thing with the left mouse button. Now, you would move around, just try to find some gray, and you could see that you get kind of a preview or a magnification in that box of what that cursor is over. So you can see right now I'm over blue sky, and you can see now I'm over the trees. So you could hopefully find something that is gray, and then you would click on it. And that hopefully gives you a perfect white balance. Now, one little tip, if you look at those numbers that are at the very bottom, you'll see R, G, and B, and there's percentages. If you want to try to get the best white balance possible, move this eyedropper around until you have R, G, and B all as close to 75 as possible. It's going to be really impossible to have all three right around 75, but you want to just get it as close as possible. And you can see probably right in there I got two of them at 64.3 and one at 63.9. If I click there, that theoretically should give me a pretty good white balance. So move around till you see 75, 75, 75, and then click away, and that should give you a good white balance. So I like that. So we're done with the eyedropper. To put it away, just click back where you got it from, and it kind of returned it back to its holder. So those are the three different ways to adjust white balance. Now the next adjustments are your tone adjustments, and there's 6 sliders for that. Now hopefully your image is exposed properly and you don't have to adjust the exposure slider, but there are times you do. You might have underexposed the image or overexposed the image, so you would adjust it here. You'd add exposure by moving that slider to the right, or take away exposure by moving it to the left. I again could reset that slider by double-clicking on the word exposure. And I actually got a little bit ahead of myself. If we look over here to the right, you could see auto. If I click on auto, Lightroom interprets the scene and auto-adjusts these tone sliders and the presence sliders, which is color and clarity, to what it thinks is a proper adjustment. I almost never have found auto to work well, at least for me, for my taste. So I don't use it. So I'm going to undo this. Now I mentioned we could just double click on the word like exposure and we reset that exposure slider. But actually there's a faster way to reset a number of sliders, especially these ones that are divided up into groups. If you hold the Alt or Option key in, Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac, you can see that where it says tone turns into reset tone. Just click on that with that Alt or Option key held in and you'll reset those sliders. Hold that Alt or Option key in again and you'll see it says reset presence. And we'll click there and we reset that one slider. So that's a faster way to reset a group of sliders. So exposure's fine on this. The shadows are kind of dark, but I could take care of those with the shadow slider, which we will in a minute. Now what I strongly recommend you do is not to adjust contrast yet. Adjust highlight, shadows, whites, and blacks first. Now I did say there's really no right or wrong way to do this. You could adjust these sliders in any order that works for you, but especially if you're just beginning, I think it's easier to adjust contrast after you've adjusted highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So, usually what most photographers do when they take especially a landscape image, their camera will tend to make the highlights a little brighter and the shadows a little darker than it actually was. So what you need to do is come in with the highlights shadow or highlight slider and pull it down because your camera made the highlights a little bit brighter than they really were. The way I do it is I tend to zoom in at the brightest part of my image, which is over here. And to zoom in, simply click on the image, and then you could drag it around by just clicking and dragging with your mouse. And I look at the brighter part, and I'll take this highlight slider and move it to the left until I think I'm seeing detail that might have been lost because the highlights were too bright. When I'm satisfied, I'll just click on the image again to zoom back out. Then what I'll do is I might zoom in on a shadows area, which are these trees are pretty dark. And then I'll go to my shadow slider and I want to open those up. So I'm going to move the shadow slider to the right to make the shadows brighter. And I'll keep moving it to the right till I'm satisfied I'm seeing all the detail I could see in the shadows, and I'm being careful that I'm not starting to overexpose the midtones. In this case, it looks like shadows have to be at plus 100 to get it to something I like. So that looks pretty good. Now, if you want to see a before and after view of your image as you're progressing with your processing, there's two different ways to do that. The first way is hit the Y key on your keyboard, Y as in yellow, and you'll see the before on the left and the after on the right. Hit the Y key again and you'll go back to your processed image. Another way is to hit the backslash key. Now, some European keyboards don't have a backslash key. If that's the case, I'm not sure what key it would be, but if you do have a backslash key, you would hit it once and you'll get the before image. Hit it again and you'll revert back to your processed image. So it toggles it from non-processed to processed. So just like that. So now we've adjusted our highlights and shadows to our liking. Next are whites and blacks. You of course could just come in here and move the white slider and the black slider till you like the look. But there's other ways you could do this. I'm going to reset those by clicking on each of the names to reset them. The first way is, you know how we clicked auto up here and it gave us these auto adjustments? Well, you could get an auto adjustment for just one slider. To do that, hold the shift key in and double click on the word whites. And it will give us the auto adjustment for whites. Hold the shift key in and double click on the word blacks and it gave us the auto adjustment for blacks. So this is an auto adjustment, but it's only for those two sliders. Sometimes that works, whereas when you clicked auto, it didn't work, adjusting all of them. Personally, I don't care for this, so I'm going to undo that by double clicking on each of the sliders' names. Now, another way you could get a good white or black point, and that's what it's called when you're adjusting your whites and blacks, you're adjusting your white and black point. Another way to do it is to hold the Alt or Option key in. It's Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac. And then click on, we're doing whites first, click on the whites slider. And you'll see when I do that, the screen turns black. Move the white slider to the right until you see something start to come through. And you'll see over there on the far left middle of the screen, I'm getting colors come through. You're going to get red. As I move it to the right, you're going to get red, green, and blue. And then you're going to get shades of gray and then eventually white. What that means is you're beginning to clip those color channels. So when you see green starting to bleed through there and a little blue starting to bleed through, I'm clipping the red channel or the blue channel and the green channel. Clipping means that you're making that color so bright or dark that you're losing any detail that it could have had. Usually we don't like a lot in our image to clip. Think about it. If you turn your brightness up by making the highlights really bright, your whites really bright, maybe turn exposure really bright, you're going to make all those white parts of your scene so bright in your image, when you print it, there won't be any detail there to print. And conversely, if you turn shadows and blacks down and you're making the darker parts of the image so dark that there's no detail left, when you print it, you're just going to have a big blob of ink. So there's no detail to print. So you'd usually, and I personally like to preserve as much detail as possible. So what you would do is you would hold that Alt or Option key, and again, it's Alt if you have a PC, Option if you have a Mac. Click on the white slider, and you'd usually have to move the white slider to the right, usually, until you see stuff start to come through. Then back it off until it is either totally gone or maybe there's just a little there. And right about there is probably where I would like it. Similarly, you would hold that Alt or Option key in and click on the blacks slider. Now this time, the screen turned totally white. Usually you would move it to the left and you'll see you're starting to clip the blacks. And you can see there's greens coming through, blues, and when you're clipping all three channels, that's all three red, green, and blue channels, you'll get black come through. Now personally, everyone has their own kind of style of doing this. Personally, I like to clip blacks a little bit. I think it adds a little more depth to my image. So I don't like to clip whites usually, but I like to clip blacks. That's for landscape images. For portraits, I don't like to clip either usually. And even for an animal portrait, I usually don't like to clip either. So in this case, already with blacks at 0, I am clipping the green channel a tiny bit in there. And I'm just going to move it down a little more, so I'm clipping even a little more, like that. Now that's my personal taste. Now my whites, as I look at the image, just don't look bright enough to me. So I'm going to come in here and take this white slider and move it just a little bit more to the right, just to brighten up the whites a little more. So usually what I do is I use that Alt Option method to get me close to where it needs to be, and then I adjust these sliders by eye to get it to what I really like. So that's how I adjust the whites and blacks, usually to get a white and black point. So experiment with it. If you've downloaded the raw files that I have and you're adjusting this image, experiment different ways and see where you could make it look good for you. Now, below that, we have the last part of the basic tab, and that is the clarity, dehaze, vibrance, and saturation sliders. Usually, I do this next, and then I come back and do contrast last. It doesn't matter. Again, you could do it any order you like. But I found, for me, that makes my images seem to pop a little better. So I would come down here. If you move clarity slider to the left, you're going to make the image kind of give this ethereal like blur to it. If you move it to the right, you're going to be making the image look sharper. And what you're doing is you're adding actually mid-tone contrast. So it makes the image look a bit sharper. So we'll start out at 0, and as I move it to the right, you can see how it's starting to make the image look sharper. Now you have to be careful with clarity. On this image, I could go pretty high with it. But if you move clarity up a little bit too high, you'll tend to enhance noise. Any noise in the image will get enhanced and be harder to get rid of. So keep that in mind. Also, if you have a very bright sky and a very dark object going up into that sky, if you move clarity up too high, you'll tend to make that dark object bleed into the sky. You've probably seen that in some photographers' images where they'll have like a black tree going up into a very bright sky, and the black tree looks like it's smudged into the sky. It also happens if you have a very dark background and a very bright object in front of that background. The white object would kind of smudge out into the sky. So that happens with clarity and a little bit with contrast. You have to be careful of those two sliders. So what I found is most landscape images that I shoot, clarity in the 30s usually is fine. Much higher than that, then you're starting to make it look a little too sharp and or going to cause issues with noise or that kind of smudging problem I mentioned. Now the dehaze slider is a slider that you don't always have to use. Often with especially landscape images, you'll get haze in the background, haze in the sky. You could get rid of that by taking this dehaze slider and move it to the right. And you can see as I move it to the right, it's kind of increasing contrast and enriching the colors a little bit. So from a creative point of view, you may want to use this just to, make your image look better and make it pop. If I move this slider to the left, I could add haze to the image. So there may be a creative reason why you want to do that. Now for this image, I think I want to move the dehaze slider just very slightly to the right, like +8. I think that looks pretty cool. Now next are vibrance and saturation. These really affect the color of the image. Vibrance will increase the saturation of every color in the image unless that color is already saturated, and it will not oversaturate any color. So it'll increase the saturation to the point of saturation. Then it won't go any further. On the other hand, saturation increases the saturation of every color. Even if that color is already saturated, and even if you're moving it to the right and you're starting to saturate colors, it will just keep going and it will oversaturate colors. So saturation is a little bit more heavy-handed than vibrance. Also, if you have an image with a person in it with skin tone, saturation will tend to increase the saturation of every color, including their skin tone. That usually doesn't look good. Vibrance, on the other hand, will increase the saturation of most colors, but it tends to not increase the saturation of skin tones as much. So vibrance might be a better choice when you're adjusting a portrait and you want to make the person's clothing and eyes pop, but you don't want their skin to look like they were caught in the sun, So usually, it's up to you. I'll move vibrance to the right a little bit, see what it does. Sometimes I'll move saturation, see what it does. Landscape image, it usually doesn't matter, but I think vibrance up to 22 looks pretty good. So let's get a before and after. I'm going to hit the backslash key. There is before and there is after. So you can see just adjusting the basic panel really made the image pop. So I'm sorry this video took so long, but there's really a lot to talk about in the basic panel and a lot of different things you could do. Now, once you're done with the basic panel, if you want to bring the other panels back that we put away, like this film strip, we could click on these triangles again and bring everything back to the way it was when we started. So there is our image so far. Now, in the next episode, we're going to do a different image and we're going to learn something else about processing in that image. If I remember right off the top of my head, I could be wrong. I think we're going to be cropping in that image. And the crop tool is right here. So we're going to be doing a lot of different things that you could do with an image with the crop tool. So look for that in the next video. Thank you, everyone that watches my videos. I truly do appreciate it. I'll talk to you guys soon.